Please do come close. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I realise that there may be one or two people who are still to come, but time is pressing, so I'm going to start. My name is Richard Blurton. I'm now retired from this august institution, but for many years, for 32 years, I was a curator here. I'm now retired, but I still continue to do work for the museum. I think it's perhaps appropriate in this gallery that we should start in the shade of Lord Ganesh, who will, I think, shower his blessings on us as we look around. But what we come mainly to see is the buildings of sculpture from Amaravati, which is in the second space right at the end of this gallery here, and we'll go down there in just a moment. Before we do that though, I'd like to just tell you a wee bit about the space that we're in. This has been a gallery for China at that end and South Asia at this end for about 50 years, I suppose. I just remember as a teenager the medieval European displays that used to be here, but now for many, many years it's been given over to the cultures of South and at one point Southeast Asia and the Far East. In 2017 we refurbished this gallery through the very generous support of the late Sir Joseph Hotung, whose name is recorded here. We know this space as the Hotung Gallery. I remember as a young curator taking Joe to India. He had not yet signed on the dotted line, so there was slight anxiety on my part. But anyway, all was well, and he, for many years, supported us. And the most recent of his benefactions was to support the refurbishment of this space. So what you see here was opened by Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II in 2017, and it will, touch wood, continue for perhaps 20 years or so. The great advantage we had when we prepared these new displays in 2017 was that we, because of technological advances, we were able to show really for the first time the great depth of our collections here, starting in the space just behind me here with the very earliest stone tools in the subcontinent, which date to about 1.5 million years ago, right up to sculpture and works of art over here that are from our own time. And those of you who are perhaps as old as me may recognize in the moving image on the screen there the dancer Ram Gopal. I don't know whether any of you remember him, but Ram lived here in London. He took London by storm in the 1940s, late 30s, early 40s, and I wanted particularly to commemorate him, especially facing the bronze sculpture of Shiva Nataraja. So there's a certain sort of program to this display. Mostly it's chronological. It runs from the space just behind me 1.5 million years ago, all the way down one side of the gallery, and then all the way up the other side. You end up with contemporary life here. The only exception to that is the Amaravati sculptures, which have a wide chronological range from about 200 BC to approximately 800 AD, so a huge period of production. And they are housed in their own separate space right at the end. The stone surface of those sculptures is highly fragile, and the space in there, you will find gloriously on such a day as this, is temperature controlled, and the air is filtered to help preserve the very fragile surface of these sculptures. So they are the only part of our new displays which don't follow an approximately chronological sweep. Now, just before we go into the gallery, you will notice, and we may come and look at later, there are displays concerning Sri Lanka, about which most of you know more than I. I've only twice been to that wonderful place, but we have some very interesting materials here from Sri Lanka. And in front of the Amaravati display, just before we go in, you will see the famous sculpture of Tara, the gilt bronze, almost life-size sculpture from Sri Lanka, from somewhere near Batticaloa on the road to Trincomalee, I suppose, isn't it? It's on the east side of the island. Anyway, that is undoubtedly our most wonderful, famous, renowned, remarkable items from all of Sri Lanka. It came to Britain in the 1830s, and it's been admired here ever since. And we feel it's highly appropriate that it has this very prominent position near the Amaravati sculptures, because, of course, the links between southern India in the Buddhist period, the Andhra period, and Sri Lanka were very great. So, without more ado, and as long as no one has any questions, let's head on down.
Thank you. Carry on. Thank you.
Do come on. Yes, okay. Yes, right, do. And there's 3 or 4 more.
Thank you.
Grand. Well, this is the space where sculpture from the ancient Buddhist site in what's now Andhra Pradesh are displayed. They've been here now in this space for about 30 years, I suppose. And as I mentioned earlier, the temperature and humidity is controlled because of the fragility of the stone. Some of you may have been to Amaravati, I don't know, in Andhra. No, okay. I have been, and it's a really wonderful experience. I would encourage you to go if you're interested in the story of, in the story of Indian Buddhism. Little survives at the site today, but there is a fine museum with interesting sculpture there. Mentioning that, I should just say that Amaravati sculpture today is scattered around the world. The main collection is in the Government Museum in Chennai. There's Egmore, if any of you know that institution. There's a large group here, but it's smaller than the one in Chennai. The museum, the site museum at Amaravati, is large and has important works of art there. And then there are individual pieces of sculpture scattered all over India. The museum in Delhi, in Kolkata, in Madras, Bombay, and even some smaller museums like Pudukkottai, for instance. I discovered some there. So it's widely scattered, but we can be absolutely certain, we know for certain, that the stupa at Amaravati, the great domed Buddhist structure with its ancillary buildings around it, built on the banks of the Krishna River just above the delta, so the river was navigable at that point. We know that this was one of the most important Buddhist sites in southern India, in the Andhra country, from about 200 BC up to approximately 800 AD. Now, the period of its greatest flourishing seems to have been in the early centuries AD, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries AD, after which the city of Nagarjunakonda, further up the Krishna Valley, and the seat of the Ikshwaku kings becomes more important, and Amaravati slowly declines in importance. Having said that, though, Amaravati made such a huge impression on the Buddhist mind in the early centuries AD that the memory of it is recorded not only in the Tibetan tradition but also in some of the Southeast Asian traditions, specifically, I know, in the Thai tradition. And some of you may be able to tell me how it's commemorated or known of in Sri Lanka. Interestingly, in the Tibetan tradition, it's remembered because it's thought, I mean, you have to suppress any ideas here about chronology, but it's thought that that the Buddha came to Amaravati and preached the Kalachakra Tantra. Now that Tantra is a 10th century AD text, so the possibility of the Buddha doing it is slightly unlikely, but who knows, maybe he did. But in the tradition, he delivered that teaching there. And that's the reason why, some of you may have heard, the Dalai Lama went there in the late 90s, I think it was in 1996, and delivered the Kalachakra Tantra there in Amaravati, because it has such a strong impression, that link between the Buddha and the place. And when I went there a few years ago, I was very moved to see that amongst the ruins of Amaravati, you will see kata, that's those white ceremonial scarves that Tibetans present to a worthy, usually a worthy person, but in this instance a worthy place. So it's very, I find it, I feel quite emotional at the thought of this tradition being so strong that people want to come and venerate the building still today as the place connected with the Buddha and now with the Dalai Lama. Now, many of you, of course, I hardly need to, but I'm going to anyway. The stupa, as we believe it was constructed at Amaravati, was a solid mound, a domed building. You can't go in a stupa, I mean, you will get that. But inside, of course, are relics. And so the building becomes sacred as a result of the deposition within it of relics. Now, we don't know what the relics were at Amaravati, nor do we know even how many reliquaries were placed inside. No reliquaries have been found that are that can be absolutely linked to the stupa itself, to the domed structure itself. There is one photograph of one rather crushed gold reliquary that was found in a nearby subsidiary stupa. But beyond that, we don't know precisely what the relics were that were held within the stupa. Nor do we know when the stupa was actually founded. In recent years, a stray find of an inscription in Brahmi characters, so probably 3rd or 2nd century BC, has been found near Amaravati, but not in an archaeological context. and not very obviously part of an Ashokan inscription. But it's certainly in Brahmi script, so it's of about that sort of period. So some people say, this proves that Amaravati has an Ashoka beginning. I'm a little more hesitant, I'm afraid. I have too much scientific training in me. But what it does obviously show is that at the time of at that time in the 3rd century BC, Amaravati was an important place, and it's entirely possible that there was a Buddhist settlement there. Beyond that, we can't really go with certainty. What we can say though, and we're just going to look at it in a moment, is that by about 200 BC, the great dome structure, the great stupa, was already being embellished and decorated. And you will notice as we go round this afternoon that many of the sculptures have inscriptions on them. Some of them now are very worn, but some are still very clear, and they're almost all donation inscriptions. They record the gift of money to build the stupa, and it's pretty clear that this is not primarily a royal endowment. This is not a structure put up by specific kings. In the past, we used to think that the Satavahana kings were very much connected with building the stupa, but that seems very much less likely today, and the inscriptions really record the donations of individuals to build this great structure. But now let's just briefly move in that direction and look at the back of this great slab. I'm going to go in by the window. Now, you will all need to come round here to look at this slab here. Now, I want you to look at this carefully because, as you will have noticed as you walked around it, it's carved on both sides. And this side is a rare survival of the earliest type of carving from Amaravati. You will see that you see the Bodhi tree, a Bodhi tree. You see an empty throne. You see the Buddha pad here. You see devotees, hands in Anjali Mudra, adoring the empty throne, which is further elaborated with parasols. So we understand that this is either the Vajrasana, the actual place where the Buddha achieved enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, or it's a shrine recording that event. So it may either be the place in Bodh Gaya or a shrine built at Amaravati where people venerated the Buddha. You will notice that there is a glaring omission there, or to us it seems an omission, but to anyone who's a devotee it's entirely unnecessary. But there is no Buddha image. The presence of the Buddha is assumed because the Buddha pad, the empty throne, the parasols, the Bodhi tree, the celestial figures here and here who are adoring the scene. And we know from elsewhere, from sites like Sanchi in Madhya Pradesh, that in the very earliest part of Buddhism there seems to have been either an actual interdict, an actual statement that the Buddha could not be shown, or it was just assumed he couldn't be shown because he had passed into nirvana, and therefore how can you show someone who doesn't exist anymore, So this rare sculpture comes from the very earliest period of Amaravati, and we think about 200 BC, that sort of date. comparing it with other early sites such as Sanchi and Barhut. Somebody may have seen the Barhut sculptures in Calcutta. They share many common features. Now, astonishingly, this stone slab got reused because we know that the stupa, the great shrine at Amaravati, was constantly being refurbished. I mean, think medieval cathedral in Europe. You start in the Lady Chapel. You also have varying doctrinal situations being presented. So the development of the idea about the present, how you can show the Buddha, this obviously has theological implications. If you believe you can show the Buddha, then to some extent he is not snuffed out in nirvana. He is someone who can perhaps be there to receive your intercessionary prayers. So it's very fascinating to view these sculpted panels in terms of both architectural change and doctrinal change. And as we go around, you'll see how this varies. Now, let's go back to where we were before and have a look at this side of it. And bear in mind that what you've just seen is perhaps from about 200 BC. This is something completely different on this side. Quite different style of carving, highly complicated, full of activity, no empty spaces, and most importantly of all, a figure of the standing Buddha. So there is a massive change here. Admittedly, it's 400 years or something, but it's a massive change in the way in which the Buddha is imagined. And also, there's a huge change in the way in which the style of depiction of figures is shown. Here we have figures shown in narrative panels. We have figures like this rather wonderful lissome girl here, shown in sort of, in poses where the body is bent, sometimes three-quarter view figures, and most astonishing of all, these aerial figures here, celestial beings who are honouring the stupa. They are, outstanding depictions of the body in motion. The figures on the other side are much stiffer, much more formulaic, if you like, whereas these ones are figures in flight. Look at this one leg across the other. It's almost like Nataraja, the way in which the leg is held across. So there's been a complete change in style. And also hugely important for us is that this reused stone depicts the stupa itself. This is how we believe the great stupa at Amaravati looked like when it was in its heyday. So, but you must remember this is in 2 dimensions, not 3 dimensions. So you're basically looking at a gateway. There were 4 gateways around the stupa, each of which was guarded by line figures. And so you can see here, 1, 2, 3, 4 lion figures. This is a gateway that has been sort of, actually, in fact, it should be out here, but it's been concertinaed in, so you can see the standing Buddha figure inside. We also know that the stupa had a magnificent railing all the way around it, originally probably in wood, but by far the majority of the time at Amaravati in stone. And this is the outer face of the railing, here and here. And this is the top of the railing, here, this coping stone, we call it. It's made, you must come and look closely in a moment, but it's made up of figures of youths holding garlands. Beyond that, there was a walkway which enabled pradakshina, enabled circumambulation around the stupa. That, because of perspective, it's all been crunched up, that's in there. And then rising above is the great dome of the stupa itself. Now, we have used this depiction as a way of presenting the sculpture here. So from here we're going to, in a moment, just walk here, and we will see a small section of the outer railing that went around the stupa itself. So when we move over there, remember the lovely figure of this young lady here, but most importantly perhaps the lotus bosses that decorate the outer face of the railing. Yes, yeah, there were 4 gates. Same.
Oh, okay.
Same. Yeah. And sorry, just a minute. And this is one of them here, and this is one of them here. Okay. So they were at the cardinal points.
Thank you.
Can I just start?
Yeah.
These two are from very different periods of time.
Very different.
Yeah, but they have been juxtaposed together.
No, it's the same piece of stone. It's the same piece of stone that was reused. We know that the stupa was constantly being refurbished, and at one point this one was considered so old-fashioned, got rid of, and instead of throwing it away, they reused it at a later period.
What is the actual material?
It's a form of limestone. Some people, it's not quite marble. It hasn't had quite the pressure to make it into marble. It comes from a quarry site called Palnad, which is inland from Amaravati. Well, yes, the surface is very fragile, especially today, because this sculpture has had quite a varied life. I haven't told you anything yet about the story of how it was discovered, but at one point some of the sculpture was brought to London and it was left outside in the sulfuric acid of Victorian London, and the surface became quite badly abraded.
So actually it was found in one place, isn't it?
Huh?
It was found in one place because the same stone done at different times.
Correct.
In one place.
Yeah.
And that was in Amaravati itself.
Yeah. But these are rare survivals. Mostly the stone was not reused, or if it was, it hasn't been recovered. We have 1 or 2 other examples in the collection where the stone has been reused. Sometimes it's turned upside down, sideways, but mostly they were discarded. And if you look here, the thickness is incredible. I mean, it's incredibly thin. It's not thick at all. And one of the features of this style, the 2nd, 3rd century AD style, is very deep carving. And it's a miracle that it didn't break through. Because you can see here how thin it is. Yeah. And before we go on, do notice the donative inscription across the top. It's in a Prakrit, and it's in late Brahmi script. So you're on the way to Telugu. I mean, you're not at Telugu yet, but the inscription on this railing pillar over here, when we get there, have a look at it because it's very clearly cut still. You can make out the way in which the vowel ligatures, the markings that go above letters that indicate vowels, these are very clear here. So, you're on the way towards Telugu script, but it's a Prakrit, so it's a post-Sanskrit language written in Brahmi character. Have a look at this. Look at the lotus bosses on the outside of the railing, and remember the way in which the dome is decorated, and then join me over here.
Sorry, what was the time difference between the
About 4 centuries.
4 centuries.
At least 4 centuries, maybe even 5. I should mention that the chronology for all of Amaravati is extremely fluid, I'm afraid. There is no certainty about who built it or when they built it. We think it was founded about 200 BC, and we know that new sculptures were still being produced in the 7th century. There's an inscription in Sri Lanka which talks about a 14th century shrine in Amaravati, but it's unclear whether they mean the stupa site or the Shiva temple at Amareshwara, which is immediately next door today to the stupa.
Thank you.
Good. Have a look. Do come on in. Do come through. Come on through if you've finished reading. Right, now I mentioned while we were looking at the carved slab just there, I mentioned specifically the railing went all the way around the stupa. The earliest stupas in India, we believe, though none have survived, the earliest ones probably had wooden railings around them. All the ones that have survived today, Barhut, Sanchi, Amaravati, and Nagarjuna, these all have stone railings. Now, if you were starting from scratch, you would be mad to make a railing of stone uprights, these elements here, 1, 2, 3, with lotus elements between them, slotted into the uprights. You know, this is not sensible stone architecture because it's so easy for them to fall out and so difficult to place them in the slots. You can probably make out in the sides of the upright pillars that there are the remains of the slots into which the lotus panels fitted. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4 uprights with their lotus medallions beside them. And these would have, they all originally had tangs on each side which slotted into the uprights. Now, if you're working in wood, this is an entirely sensible thing to do. But if you're working in stone, it's bonkers. But clearly, by the early centuries, late centuries BC, this had become the religious standard. It wouldn't be correct if there wasn't a railing of this sort around the stupa, even though in stone it is so ungainly. Now, any of you who live here in London will probably know the stupa in Battersea Park, the Japanese stupa there. Well, you will see exactly the same thing. I think there it's probably even done in concrete, I'm not certain. Anyway, it's not in wood. And anything that isn't in wood doesn't structurally make sense. But it's a wonderful example of something that becomes fixed as the religious standard, and therefore it's always done that way. Now, as you can see, this outer face is predominantly a celebration of the open lotus. And bearing in mind that devotees coming to the stupa would see this first of all. This is a most appropriate symbol to see. The open lotus, a symbol of purity, beauty, indicating separation from the mundane world outside to the spiritual realm inside. And it's become a very renowned element of the Amaravati sculptures. Those of you who are many here, I'm sure, who know the later Sri Lankan iteration will see that the half lotuses with running animals are very close to what in Sri Lanka would be considered moonstones, entranceways. So this is an area where there was no doubt a lot of interplay between the flourishing Buddhism in Andhra and Buddhism in Sri Lanka. It's a very fascinating subject, the degree to which one area is influencing the other and vice versa. But we do know that there was lots of contact. There's a wee sculpture in the gallery outside that I've found in our basement that is from a Sri Lanka collection, found in Sri Lanka, but it's made of the same marble as Amaravati. So, there was clearly to and fro between the Buddhists in Sri Lanka and in Andhra. And it's worth mentioning also, of course, strangely, Amaravati, the Krishna Valley, the Godavari Valley, all that part of southern Andhra was intensely Buddhist in the first part of the first millennium AD. There are a huge number of Buddhist sites, many of them not well known today. Amaravati is certainly the most famous, but Nagarjunakonda, of course, up the river, and recently this spectacular discovery at Kanaganahalli, further up the Krishna Valley, where a stupa with almost all its sculptures in place has been recorded. So you have to think of the Krishna Valley, Godavari Valley to a slightly lesser extent, the seaboard of Andhra going down towards Sri Lanka. This was a place of intense Buddhist activity and intense commercial activity. You don't get to build a weaponry structure like this and endow it with monastic communities who, although are highly desired, are, from a sort of Marxist point of view, they're economically, unproductive. So to support all of that and to build structures like this, Amaravati was only one, it was probably the most important, but it's only one of very many. To build this, there must have been a huge amount of surplus production. And, the exact mechanics of all of this is still being worked out. Undoubtedly trade was the main engine of this economic activity, and there's lots of speculation and some proof of economic activity with the West, with Saudi Arabia, and even with the Roman world. So, and that's going west, and then also there's quite good evidence of activity in Southeast Asia. So we have to imagine that the Andhra country was a hive of activity, both commercial and religious, but not particularly monarchical. We don't know of great dynasties that are connected with these wonderful Buddhist structures. So it's a very fascinating and constantly changing view that as we go along is slowly coming into focus. Someone mentioned to me while we were waiting downstairs the recent exhibition that we met in New York, Tree and Serpent. Now that's, as it were, the latest statement about Andhra culture, Andhra Buddhist culture. It's a magnificent book, sadly I didn't see the exhibition, but that is drawing on evidence from all over the Deccan Plateau for these remarkable Buddhist sites which flourished in the first part of the first millennium AD. So pilgrims coming to Amaravati would first of all have seen this. Lotus blossom, full-blown lotus blossom, welcoming them to the structure. And our example is straight, but you have to imagine that it was curved because it's going around the outside of the stupa. The great pillars are held in place by weight, by gravity. Those sculpted panels across the top, these, we call them the coping stones, those sat on the top of the railing to keep it in place. And you may remember when we were looking at the slab here, along we saw the railing with the lotus blossoms, these lotuses here, and on top of that was a coping stone, and that's it there. So those depictions of the stupa are hugely important in enabling us to understand what the ancient structure is like. Right, now we're going to go... Oh, Kevin,
these figures,
yeah, Gandha.
those three figures,
Yeah.
yeah, in most of the Sri Lankan temples, we have them all around the fences and around the buildings. We call them Bhairava.
Ah, yes. Well, they're very... at this time in India and later also, these little dwarf figures are considered highly auspicious. And these ones can play instruments. Later still, they accompany Shiva, of course. And Lord Ganesh, of course, is the Ishvara of the Ganas. He's the Lord of the Ganas. So these are part of a long tradition in
If you
the
go to a
subcontinent.
place like Kalaniya Temple, you have it all around.
Yeah, that's
These
right.
figures.
They're highly auspicious. I mean, it's
Like a guarding figures.
well, I think more auspicious, but yeah, guardian also perhaps. They always seem to be having such fun.
Yeah.
Has she ever been painted?
Well, this is a moot point about which I and some of my colleagues don't agree. There's one sculpture that survives with even just the remains of some colourings, so from that people extrapolate that the whole thing was painted. Well, it may have been painted, but it's very unclear. I rather like the idea of a pristine white structure, but who knows?
How much, on the subject of influence, how much do you think monolithic sites like Kailash and on the western seaboard of India lent influence?
Oh, sorry.
So, like Kailash and Ellora Caves,
Yes.
how much do you think that influenced this period?
Well, they're much later, of course, much later. Because here we're, 2nd century AD,
Right.
whereas Kailashanatha is, it's Rajputa, isn't it? Sort of 11th century, something like that. So it's somewhat later. And of course, the amazing bit about Kailashanatha is that it's all cut out of the living rock. Whereas this is structural, this is all built.
So in that respect, do you think the skills then lent themselves
Who knows?
to the development?
Who knows? I mean, one of the really extraordinary unresolved questions about stone structural architecture in India is how, in the 2nd century AD, you get something like this of enormous scale and complexity, and then 5 centuries later you get into the something like this, something really quite modest. And there's obviously a sort of there's a mismatch there. So where these skills move, I don't know, is it to Sri Lanka? I don't know. Right, let's move round inside. And remember, and we really should put it that way in the correct direction.
Richard, was there any evidence about the entrance stones like that? So there were some sort of entrance stones, like moonstones. Was there any evidence of...
I mean, there are gates.
Yes, at the
But
gates,
not-
nothing, no.
Right, now, bear in mind what you've just seen. The outer face of the railings only decorated with full-blown lotuses. Nothing else, except a few guns. But otherwise, nothing. Now, when you walk through the gateways, one of those 4 gateways guarded by lions, and you enter the Pradakshinapath around the dome of the stupa, you must imagine the dome of the stupa is up there, what you see is highly decorated, highly figured sculptures. And these are the inner faces of those railings decorated with lotus blossoms. And these, some of the scenes you will recognize. This one's quite well known. This is the great departure, of course. This is the moment when Prince Siddhartha leaves the palace.
The renunciation. Renunciation.
Yes, yeah, correct. And I find this particularly attractive, this depiction of it. There are many at Amaravati, but this one's particularly interesting because you have to remember that that Siddhartha, Prince Siddhartha, left the palace in the quiet of night. He didn't wake anyone. And as you can see, he is accompanied here by several people, but they're mostly celestials. There are a few gunners, a few dwarfish figures who are holding up the hoofs of the horse so that the noise isn't heard, the noise of the departure is not heard. And all around are celestial figures who are honouring the moment of his departure, in silence, of course, so that no one hears. But the sculptor here is clearly showing off his ability to cram as many figures into one scene as possible. And it's, I find it very attractive that there is this sort of desire to show off. And you know, we have back views, we have partial views, we have side views, and there at the centre is the figure. Buddha to be riding his horse out of the city gates. You can still just see the city gates. I didn't mention anything about cities. Now, Amaravati, if you've been there, you will know is located on the edge of an ancient walled site called Dharmikota or Dhanyakataka. And it's no coincidence that there is that connection between ancient city and ancient religious site. And we know both from texts and from practice in the ancient world that Buddhist stupas should not be in a city, that would be inappropriate, but also they should not be so far away from the city that they can't receive alms. So it's entirely appropriate that that ancient site of the Dhanyakota, which is only very slightly excavated, should be located just upriver from the ancient site of the stupa itself. And we get some idea of what it might have looked like from those gateways there. The ancient secular architecture of India is almost totally lost to us. There are no great palaces surviving from this period. So sculptural depictions of ancient palaces, ancient sites is extremely important. Other scenes are either jatakas, in previous life stories of the Buddha, or they're scenes of veneration of the empty throne we have here. This one is very fascinating. The empty throne with a sort of fiery pillar behind it. And bearing in mind that only a few centuries later, in this part of South India, you have depictions of fiery Shiva Linga. You can't help but wonder whether there's some overlap here, at least in iconography. Others, they show either scenes from the life of the Buddha or jataka stories, or scenes of veneration. And as you see at the top, the whole thing is held in place by that huge copal story. Now, imagining still that we're doing production around the stupa, let's turn and look this way. It is a stupa, yes. We don't. You will notice I didn't tell you what that narrative is because no one knows. That's quite. I should also have said, I suppose, earlier that one of the intriguing features of Amaravati is that many of the narrative scenes that are shown we can't interpret. We can interpret, scenes like the Great Departure, we know what that is, or certain jatakas, we can recognize them because of the texts. But what we don't know about Buddhism in Andhra is that we don't have surviving the texts that were used by Andhra Buddhists. We can look to Sri Lanka for comparanda, but even still, we just don't know which texts the mostly Mahasangika communities in Andhra were using. And so, we have to look much further afield, sometimes even into Chinese and Tibetan translations out of Sanskrit, and the Sanskrit is almost certainly translated out of Pali. It's a very tricky topic, not having any continuity in the Andhra country. Probably some of the commentarial tradition in Sri Lanka, if it was translated, would help us with this. But it's a long-term project.
Is there a monastic life?
Well, you're very wise to raise this question. There is no physical evidence of monasticism at Amaravati. The monastery complex, which must have been there, has never been recovered. But we know there were monks at the site because they're recorded in inscriptions. So they were there, and nuns also. But there's no physical evidence. Unlike at Nagarjunakonda, there are lots of monastic cells and so on, but they don't survive at Amaravati. It's a curious feature. Now, what you see here is further sculpted slabs of the type that we saw earlier, which I call portraits. They're depictions of the stupa itself, and we believe that they decorated the lower story of the domed structure of the stupa. So if the dome is way above us up there, sorry?
What height?
Oh dear, don't know, sorry. Tall, yes. Think Sri Lanka. Well, we don't know. Perhaps this is the occasion for me to say something about the history of the building itself. We don't know how tall it was because in modern times, initially it was used as a quarry. So a local Raja ransacked part of it to build his palace and probably to build the Amareshwara temple nearby. And then later various archaeologists dug rather unscientifically, and the mound that the tall mound that was there, no, I mean it's gone completely. So we have no idea of its actual size. We know its circumference, but not its height. And the local ruler at one point built a tank, a water tank in the dome, in the top of the dome. So there's almost no sculpture from the dome. We know what the dome looked like because we have the portraits, but there is no sculpture that we know that we can say absolutely comes from the dome. Nothing here, railings and all the lower part, but nothing above, probably because that tank built on the top of it.
Yes. So what was the actual circumference?
Oh dear, I thought you were going to ask me that.
Sorry. roughly, okay. Get some sense of size, I suppose.
I'll send Amal.
Okay, that's fine.
It's
a high art.
Huh?
I told him you're a scientist, so you want approximate.
It's not as huge as that.
It's the radius multiplied by pi.
Anyway,
more confusing.
that returning to these slabs, which we think was the drum slabs, that is the dome, huge dome above us, rests on a wider drum. And these sculpted panels, we believe, decorated the lower part of the drum. And they show, as you can see, the stupa itself. Now, they look, at first glance, sort of uniform, but actually they're not. And I'm very intrigued to work out the differences. But one of the obvious ones is this one and this one. These first two, they go together in that, you see, there is no Buddha image in the gateway. There is only Dhammachakra on a pillar and a reliquary, honouring a reliquary, but no Buddha image. These two have standing Buddha image in Abhaya Mudra, and this one, very unusually, has Muchalinda. You know the story of the snake protecting the seat of Buddha. This image, of course, is very well known in, I don't know in Sri Lanka, perhaps it is, but certainly in Southeast Asia, very, very frequently that scene of the Buddha protected by the... Huh?
They have statues.
Yeah, in Thailand, Burma, all those sorts of places. But in India, it's exceptionally rare. So what does it mean that it turns up here? And because we don't have any of those surviving texts, I feel we should try and tease out what these individual, separate appearances of unusual images implies. Are they doctrinal? Are they, theological in some way? Or is it just one person's particular devotion? If you think of devotion today in the subcontinent, there are lots of places where individual devotion is sanctified at one particular image. So is that what's happening here? We don't know, but we need a lot more work being done. And the exhibition recently in New York is a sort of starting point, really, rather than an ending point, because there they brought together so much material from all over the Deccan, and now we need to check for things like, does Muchalinda appear in other sites? Is it at Kanaganapalli? Is it a regional feature, for instance? We know that there was a highly vivid and substantial Buddhological debate in southern India in the early centuries AD. There was a lot of theological debate. We know that different sects were present there. We have records in inscriptions, but we often don't know precisely what their differences were. And it's very, very, I was going to say intriguing, but it's also very frustrating, of course, that you can't be certain what these differences mean.
Is there any depiction of Ashoka's nothing? And
Kanaganapalli, yes.
And the four sites, they are in this story?
No.
Unusual.
No, I don't think there are. And there are, of course, there are Ashtamangala. And actually, around the corner here, we'll see in a moment, there's a Buddha park with the Ashtamangala. And that presumably means something. I mean, we know how to identify it, but what does it actually mean? That's the very intriguing thing today. We can identify that, certain Jatakas are here, certain depictions of the Buddha, but why are only certain of them here and not others? That's where scholarship has got to develop for the future.
Do you think it might have something to do with the hand of the sculptor himself? Were there workshops?
Well, it's possible, but that you have to have patrons to do work like this. So it's almost certain that, Joe Blogg says, here's a bag of gold, do me mucha linda, because I have a particular devotion. I'm being facetious, but you see what I mean? Thousands. And that, going back to what I said earlier about all this useless activity economically. There were all these people who could spend their lives carving and producing this magnificent structure for no obvious economic benefit. So there must be an immense economic output to support that activity. Now, above, thinking that we're looking at the dome, we have symbols of the Buddha. You'll recognize them. Bodhi tree, Dhammachakra, Stupa, True Ratna. And presumably these come from that time of the stupa's history when the Buddha image was not depicted. So these are presumably something like 1st century BC, 1st century AD. Now we know from depictions of the stupa itself that actually at a later period there were lots of figured scenes on the dome. So these have to be, or we presume that these are later than those. Of course, I'm making the assumption that the not showing the Buddha, the aniconic phase, necessarily must come earlier than later. But it may not be. It may again be regional. Maybe monks from one particular school, one particular sect said, no images. Another one said, we will have images. And the appearance of images of the Buddha is closely connected with the slow development of the Mahayana. Because, if you have an image of the Buddha, if you believe that everyone has the ability to reach Buddhahood, you start getting the idea of multiple Buddha images and Buddhas of the future, Buddhas of the past. And then you get the idea that, well, being a Buddha, just saving your own soul, is not nearly as valuable as enabling other people to. And therefore the development of the Bodhisattva ideal. That apparently was all happening in southern India. The traditions say that scholars like Nagarjuna, the great theologian in southern India, that he lived and worked in the Andhra country, and people like him, and we don't know the precise details, but texts that he's connected with seem to be promoting this idea of the Bodhisattva ideal.
What century?
3rd century, 2nd, 3rd century AD. But it's gradual, it's very gradual. And it's not that, one day everyone woke up and said, oh, it's Mahayana from now onwards. No, it wasn't like that at all. And it seems certain that there were sects all in the same monastery often who espoused different sectarian beliefs. Yeah. It's we have to rid ourselves of the idea of Protestants and Catholics doing this. It was all much more organic, but not on display here. But in our reserves, we have some not very well preserved, but nevertheless identifiable Mahayana images from Amaravati. There's Manjusri, there's Vajrapani, there's Avalokiteshvara. So, in the 8th century, approx. I mean, the dating here is extremely uncertain.
Is there active scholarship now?
Oh, there is, yes. Yes, yeah. I mean, it's so intriguing because there's a lot of physical evidence, but almost no textual evidence, and no living tradition. That's where you're so lucky in Sri Lanka. You have that long living tradition. Whereas, Buddhism hasn't been important in the Andhra country for, 1,500 years. Let's move on and just look at that railing straight in front of you, Amar. Royal figure at the top, 1 foot down, in the Rajalasana position. Below him, 2 female figures. They look as if they're playing a game, perhaps Pachisi or something like that. But really fascinating is below them.
Someone's playing the flute as well.
Below them is a wonderful dancer and her musicians. And you're right, there's a flautist. Here's someone with those little symbols you see in bhajans. Here's a double-ended drum. And now you'll need to come close to see this, but this is the back view of someone playing a lute, a large-bedded lute. Now, those are not instruments that have survived in ancient India, in India today. There's no lute as such in Indian music. And even more extraordinary, facing her, this figure here, you can perhaps see her fingers stroking the strings of a harp. Now, this is one of those harps, a bow harp, that is like this. Here are the strings, and here is the top of the bow. Now, you'll need to, can you see it? Now, again, that sort of harp is unknown in India and has been unknown for at least 1,000 years, perhaps longer. The place where it is still very prominent, even to this day, it's indeed the national musical instrument of that country, is Burma. Anyone who's been to Burma, you will have been forced to listen to a harp recital. And I can't help wondering whether, like Buddhism, coinage, script, dharma, all these things that came from India into Southeast Asia also came the harp.
And it's usually between Burma and Sri Lanka.
Yes. But I don't think this is via Sri Lanka. This is direct. And it's just a wee reminder, I can't prove it, but it's just a small reminder of the fact that the Andhra country, which has sort of dropped out of historical visibility in recent centuries, but it's clear, or it seems to us now clear, that it was immensely important in the dissemination eastwards to Burma, Thailand, Laos, the rest of Southeast Asia, was incredibly important in the dissemination of not only Buddhism, not only religion, but also all these other activities. So that's, I thought I should point out to you.
Because you would walk by that, I would walk by that and not see any relevance.
Frankly, for many years I didn't notice it either. But there's a wonderful musicologist, now retired, who's at SOAS, Richard Blurton, and he pointed it out to me. And so I put it in a recent book I published. I thought it's just so important that people should think about music and also games. Games, this is another element that travels. Many of us, as youngsters, played Ludo. Now, Ludo is a very, very simplified form of the Indian game Pachisi. And that looks like what they're playing there. It's something that can easily be carried. The knowledge of how to play it is, can easily and swiftly be carried. And you could imagine the way in which merchants coming from the Krishna Delta, the Krishna River, where Amaravati is located, carrying with them in the ship, a handkerchief folded up with the countess inside it, and beside them perhaps the harp as well. Who knows?
Because of Krishna, there's the cows there, the cow.
Yeah.
1, 2, 3. they are representing as well.
They're representing, yes.
Today.
Yeah, certainly. This is an intriguing scene. Some of you may be able to solve it for us, but it appears that these figures here are offering milk or some food to a snake.
Can you see this?
Anyone know that story? I mean, it's probably a bit out of a Jataka, but
It's not like the churning of the ocean sort of snake type.
don't know. We just don't know. I mean, mention the Jatakas also reminds me that I mentioned we've lost all the texts of the Andhra Buddhists. It's quite likely that, we know it's the case that the listing of the Jatakas that we know today, 247 different Jataka stories that, they're all published by Cambridge University Press. I have copies at home. There were almost certainly lots of others.
Yeah.
And they've, over the centuries, got sort of, some have got discarded, some have been added. We know that certain ones have been added. And the tradition in Burma, for instance, is not the same as elsewhere in Southeast Asia. So, these may well be Jatakas that have just dropped by the wayside over the years. So,
But in Sri Lanka,
huh?
in Sri Lanka particularly, and also the other countries, when the Mahinda came,
Yes.
he brought art and music and culture and craft and all.
Well,
everything.
that story is almost certainly a memory of how, a memory of all being in one, in person of that one figure, but it's certainly a memory of how these things came from. You're absolutely right.
But that's very prominent because he's kind of next to the Buddha. He's the most revered person who came from him, and he's like the Buddha that he's got named in the title. That's what
Right, now before we finish, I just want to end on an auspicious note. Above us here is this wonderfully preserved Buddha. I tend not to call these footprints, which most people do. They're not a print, they're not an impression, they're a three-dimensional version, if you like, of the foot of the Buddha. But there we have wonderful chakra in the center, and then around it, less visible, but I hope you can make out Triratna and Srivatsa and probably some of the other Ashramangala. And then the whole thing is surrounded by this magnificent swirling vine issuing from this gunner down at the bottom right hand. So a very auspicious point on which to end. Yes, I have said little when I should have said more about this story, that is, how the stupa was found in modern times and how this sculpture came to the British Museum. I'll just very briefly do that. The first mention of Amaravati in modern times is the writing of this character, Colonel Colin Mackenzie. He later became the first Surveyor General of India in the British period. He visited the site in the very late 18th century and recorded that there was this mound. And very interestingly, he thought it was Jain, because of course the Jains were still present in India at that time. There were no Buddhists in India at that time, other than in the Himalayas. But for the most part, Buddhism had just completely disappeared. So he didn't understand what it was on that first visit. However, later, in 1816, he went back and better understood it. He realized it was Buddhist, and he took with him draftsmen who made drawings of the structure and the sculptures. And these, thank goodness, have survived, and they're in the British Library. So they're a fantastic record for us. Some of them show sculptures that are here that are no longer in such good condition. This sculpture, for instance, here, the top on the left side, you can see that there are some Nile figures. You just see the Nile, a Nagaraja and a Nandini. So the left. And in the case of Taurus, there is a record of this which shows so they're hugely important resources. He extracted some sculpted slabs which were taken down to Madras. Nothing else happened. One or two, really very small number, came back to London then. But the really big moment, as far as the British Museum is concerned, is excavations that took place in the 1850s, conducted by a man called Sir George Eliot, Sir Walter Eliot. And the sculptures that he excavated are mostly here today. Later excavations that were done throughout the latter part of the 19th century and then throughout the 20th century are either in Chennai, there's a big collection there, or at Amaravati itself in the Site Museum. The ones that came to London in the 1850s went into the Museum of the East India Company, which was variously housed, never very well. And in 1880, thank goodness, all the sculpture in that collection came to the British Museum, including Amaravati. And they've been on public display ever since, except for a short period when it was realised that they needed these special conditions to be shown, and they were kept in a basement with those special conditions in place. But fortunately, in 1982, I think the inscription there says, they were rehoused here thanks to the generosity of a Japanese bank. And I can't help thinking that this group of sculptures, which is covered in donative inscriptions, is rather well housed today in this gallery, which has at its entrance a donative inscription. I think what goes round comes round. And all, good Buddhists in Japan, good Buddhists in the past. So I think I've spoken for far too long, I think, but I hope you will relay the same things.
What is in the center? Is it a rose or a Dharma
No, chakra.
Dharma chakra.
Yeah. They're all the same things. But it's not literally, a print is an impression. That is not an impression. If you go to Bodh Gaya, there's a magnificent impression there. But this is sort of raised up. It's in 3 dimensions, isn't it? It's the base of the foot that's depicted. There are, you're right. It's as if the wood is above. One or two things I haven't mentioned, which I should just briefly. This pillar here, do have a look at it as you go out. It's from the circumambulatory walkway around the stupa, and there was clearly early on an idea that a way in which a donor could gain merit, I suppose, but also to elaborate and decorate the stupa was to fund a pillar that would go in the walkway. This pillar, we know from the was given by a Pashuniac. So someone probably from flowers and ground up wood and so on. So that, he obviously made enough money to be able, it had to be paid somehow.
Exactly.
But do have a look at it, because something that I think is very interesting is going on that pillar. The carving, it seems to me, I'd be interested to hear what you said, is very close to wood carving. It's very shallow. It's like a block used in wood cut printing. It's not deeply cut sculpture that comes out of a deep familiarity with stone. So this, I think, comes right at the beginning. It's still closely related to that ancient tradition in wood. So do have a look at that. And then the other thing, down at the end there is a screen. And it's a wee little film that I put together when we reopened this space. And I hope nothing that I've said will contradict what you see there. But it may just fix in your minds what we've been looking at, because this is one of the great jewels of this institution. It's less known about than it should be. Not completely flippantly, I suggested when they were talking about how the round reading room, which is of course a domed building, should be reused. I said they should put the Amaravati sculpture there, so we had one domed building inside another domed building, and India South Asia would be right at the centre of the museum. Sadly, that hasn't yet happened. But interestingly, if you go to some of those great metropolitan centres in the subcontinent, it's clear that the British period government wanted to be sure that those great centres had examples of the great sculptural achievements throughout India. So you go to Calcutta, you can see Gandhara from what's now northwest Pakistan, you can see Amaravati, you can see Baraput, which is from Madhya Pradesh, you can see sculpture from all over India. And it's the same in Chennai. It seems as if there was a deliberate policy to ensure that things were spread around.
Yeah, there's a beautiful place in Takshila.
Yes.
Have you been there?
Yes, in a previous life. It was about 45 years ago or something. Yeah, long ago. So do have a look at the pillar and do have a look at the screen. And I'm here for a bit if you want to ask questions. And I don't know whether we've got...
No, I mean, first of all, I'd like to officially sort of bring this to an end, as it were. And thank you, Richard, for a really fabulous afternoon of inquiry that we can learn from. And we couldn't have found, I think, a better person to take us round the gallery than you, Richard. The Marble Society, of course, has some strong connections to India, with our founder, wanting to reclaim the sites during the British time.
Yeah, and sorry, just to interrupt there, sorry to do so, but if you're interested in Bodh Gaya, there is a display in the gallery out here concerned with Bodh Gaya.
Okay.
Because Sir Alexander Cunningham, who was the first head of the Archaeological Survey of India, worked at Bodh Gaya, and it was under him that the temple moved from being a Vaishnava shrine into being once more a Buddhist one.
Right.
And excavations were done there actually at the Vajrasana.
Yes.
And those, the items that were discovered then in the Vajrasana are on display here.
Yeah.
So we could have a look at them as we go out if you want. Sorry, I interrupted.
No. So in addition to thank you, Richard, I just want to say that we posted this notice that this was going to happen, and the tickets sold out in a day. Okay. So
gosh, me and Tina Turner.
Exactly. So hopefully we could have had 4 times the number of people who come today quite easily. But obviously we put a ceiling on it. Perhaps with your kindness, we might do something next year on a similar way that invite some people beyond it.